In the untamed heart of Montana Territory, legends aren't born from whispers. They're carved from blood and bone. For 2 years, the Widowmaker's ghost had rested, buried beneath the gentle smile of Mariah Matthews, loving wife and mother-to-be. She'd traded her deadly reputation for a quiet life, building something beautiful with a man who saw past her scars. But on the night the Kane Gang stormed their ranch, they didn't just threaten a family. They awakened something that should have stayed sleeping. They weren't the first to make this mistake. The Carson Gang had done the same, all 12 of them dying in a single night, their bodies arranged like a grim painting in the desert sun. 3 territories had learned to fear her name, spoken in trembling whispers around campfires. The Widowmaker doesn't kill you for what you've done. She kills you for what you might do. 27 confirmed kills, each one a message written in gunsmoke and steel. Now, 7 months pregnant and surrounded by Montana's most vicious outlaws, Mariah watches them celebrate their supposed victory. They see a helpless woman, a convenient hostage. They don't understand that a wolf is most dangerous when protecting her unborn cub. They haven't realized that every minute she spends in their captivity isn't about survival. It's about choosing the order in which they'll die. The Kane Gang thought they were writing their own legend. Instead, they're about to become a chapter in hers. Because the Widowmaker didn't retire, she was just waiting for a reason to remind the world why even death itself fears her name. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The morning sun painted long shadows across the Montana Territory, its golden rays catching the morning dew on the prairie grass surrounding Caleb and Mariah's ranch. The peaceful scene was broken only by the rhythmic sound of hammer striking wood as Caleb worked to repair a section of fence, his strong hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Here's some water, love." Mariah's voice carried across the gentle breeze as she approached, one hand resting on her swollen belly, the other carefully balancing a tin cup. Her dark hair was tied back with a faded red bandana, wisps escaping to frame her face in the morning light. Caleb looked up, his weather-worn face breaking into a warm smile. "You're supposed to be resting," he chided gently, but gratefully accepted the water. "Can't keep me cooped up in that house all day," Mariah replied with a quiet laugh, picking up a hammer of her own. "Besides, the baby seems to like the fresh air." She moved with surprising grace for someone 7 months along, her movements precise and controlled as she helped position a new fence post. "You're the strongest woman I know," Caleb said, watching her with admiration. "Most folks would be taking it easy, but here you are, building fences." "Life doesn't stop just because we're expecting," Mariah responded, her eyes scanning the horizon briefly before returning to their task. "Though I suppose I should take it a bit easier once." The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through their conversation. A lone rider appeared on the dirt road leading to their ranch, his black duster catching the morning light. Mariah's hands stilled on the fence post, her posture subtly shifting. "Morning, folks," the rider called out as he drew closer. "Name's Declan Graves. Hope you don't mind me passing through your property." Caleb straightened, wiping his hands on his pants. "Welcome, Mr. Graves. Can we offer you some water for your journey?" But Mariah had already taken a step back, her expression carefully neutral. "I should check on the stew," she said quietly, though her eyes never left the stranger. Declan's gaze followed her movement, a barely perceptible smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Much obliged, ma'am," he said, dismounting with fluid grace. "Been riding since dawn, and your ranch is the first sign of civilization I've seen." As Mariah turned toward the house, Declan's voice carried after her, soft but clear. "Careful with that stew, Miss Widow. Wouldn't want anything to boil over." Mariah's step faltered for just a moment, but she continued walking, her back straight as a rail. Caleb glanced between them, confusion creasing his brow. "Miss Widow?" he questioned, but Declan had already turned his attention to his horse's saddle, adjusting straps that didn't need adjusting. "Just a common saying where I'm from," Declan replied smoothly. "Your wife reminds me of someone I once knew." "Thank you for the water, Mr. Matthews." "Caleb Matthews." "Mr. Matthews." Declan tipped his hat, remounting his horse with the same fluid grace. "You've got yourself a fine piece of land here." and an interesting wife. With that, he turned his horse and rode off, leaving Caleb standing by the fence, hammer forgotten in his hand. Inside the house, Mariah stood at the window, watching Declan's departure with unblinking eyes. Her hand absently traced the wooden spoon hanging from a hook, her fingers brushing past it to touch, for just a moment, a small notch in the wall that could have been made by a bullet. As the day progressed, Caleb noticed Mariah's unusual quietness. She moved through her tasks with the same efficiency as always, but her eyes frequently drifted to the horizon, particularly the eastern ridge where dust clouds occasionally rose from distant riders. "More travelers?" Caleb asked, coming in from the barn as the sun began to set. "Perhaps," Mariah replied, her voice carrying an edge he'd never heard before. She was standing by the window again, one hand resting on her belly, the other holding a kitchen knife she'd been using to prepare dinner. The way she held it, casual yet ready, made something stir in Caleb's memory, a detail that seemed important but slipped away before he could grasp it. Miles away, as darkness settled over the prairie, Silas Kane sat with his gang around a small campfire, their horses ground-tied nearby. The firelight cast shifting shadows across their faces as they hunched over a crude map drawn in the dirt. "Matthews Ranch is here," Silas said, marking an X with a stick. "According to our friend in town, he's got himself a nice little nest egg saved up. Been selling prime cattle all season." "What about the rancher himself?" asked one of the men, a scarred fellow named Tucker. Silas spat into the fire. "Nothing to worry about. Town folks say he's soft. All about honest work and fair deals." He sneered at the words. "His pregnant wife's the only other person on the property." "Pregnant?" A younger outlaw shifted uncomfortably. "Boss, maybe we should." "Shut it, Billy," Silas snapped. "That makes it perfect. He'll pay whatever we ask to get her back safe. No man's gonna risk his woman, an unborn child." The gang murmured in agreement, though Billy still looked uncertain. Jed, the oldest among them, studied the map with narrowed eyes, but kept his thoughts to himself. "We move at midnight," Silas declared, kicking dirt over their planning. "Quick and quiet. Get in, grab the woman, leave Matthews tied up but alive. We need him mobile enough to fetch the ransom." Back at the ranch, Caleb and Mariah had just settled in a bed when the first dog started barking. Then, abruptly, it went silent. Mariah sat up instantly, her hand reaching for something that wasn't there. "Caleb," she whispered urgently, "get your gun." But before he could reach the rifle by the door, it burst open. Shadows poured into the room, and the air filled with shouts and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Caleb lunged forward, trying to protect Mariah, but a rifle caught him in the temple. He went down hard, consciousness wavering. Through blurred vision, he saw Mariah fighting, moving with a precision that seemed impossible for a pregnant woman. She dropped one man with an elbow to the throat, grabbed another's gun arm with practiced ease. But then Silas's voice cut through the chaos. "One more move, and I put a bullet in your husband's head." Mariah froze, her eyes finding Caleb's prone form. Something passed across her face. Calculation, decision, acceptance, before she allowed her arms to be pulled behind her back. "Smart choice," Silas growled. "Wouldn't want anything happening to your little one, would we?" As they dragged her out, Mariah caught Caleb's gaze one last time. There was something in her eyes, not fear but determination, and perhaps apology. Then a boot connected with his head, and darkness claimed him. When consciousness returned, Caleb found himself tied to one of his own fence posts, the rope cutting into his wrists. Dawn was just breaking, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. His head throbbed, dried blood caking the side of his face. "Mariah," he shouted, his voice raw. "Mariah." Only the wind answered him. With a grunt of pain and effort, he began working at his bonds, ignoring the way the rough rope tore at his skin. "I'm coming for you," he promised the empty air. "I swear I'm coming." At the Outlaws' camp, miles away, Mariah sat with her back against a tree, watching the gang's movements with unervingly steady eyes. They'd bound her hands, but not her feet, an oversight that made her want to smile, though she kept her expression neutral. "Ain't natural," young Billy muttered to Jed, casting glances at their captive. "Way she's just sitting there, watching. Most women would be crying, begging." Jed studied Mariah thoughtfully, noting the way she tracked each man's position, the way she'd positioned herself with clear sight lines in all directions. "Maybe she ain't most women," he replied quietly. On a ridge overlooking the camp, Declan Graves dismounted silently, using his spyglass to survey the scene below. His expression remained impassive as he watched Mariah being guarded by the gang, but his fingers drummed a thoughtful pattern on his saddle horn. Well, he murmured to himself. The Widowmaker, caught like a common farmer's wife. Now isn't that interesting? He settled in to watch, making no move to intervene. Below, Silas strutted around the camp, already counting the ransom money in his head. Once Matthews pulls together the cash, we'll be living like kings. Maybe we'll even be generous and give him back his pretty wife in one piece. The gang laughed, but Mariah didn't react. Her eyes continued their careful scan of the camp, noting weapons, distances, personalities. She saw how Tucker favored his left leg, how Billy's gun hand shook slightly when he was nervous. She marked the location of every weapon, every horse, every possible escape route. When Jed brought her some water, she accepted it with a quiet thank you that made him study her face more closely. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met," he said under his breath, "or the most dangerous." Mariah took a sip of water, her eyes meeting his over the rim of the cup. She didn't answer, but something in her gaze made Jed step back quickly, his hand unconsciously moving closer to his gun. As the sun climbed higher, Mariah settled in to wait, her calm demeanor masking the calculations happening behind her eyes. She thought of Caleb, of their unborn child, of the life she'd built so carefully. She thought of the past she tried to leave behind, and the skills she might soon need to call upon again. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. Not the smile of a frightened captive, but the patient expression of a predator biding its time. The gang had made a terrible mistake, but they didn't know it yet. They would, though. They would. The morning sun climbed higher over the outlaw camp, casting long shadows through the pine trees. Silas Kane stood near the campfire, chewing on a piece of tough jerky as he watched his men guard their pregnant captive. Mariah sat quietly under a weathered oak tree, her bound hands resting in her lap, her eyes never still. "Boss," Jed approached, his voice low and gravelly. "Something ain't right about her." Silas spat out a piece of gristle. "She's just a woman, Jed. A farmer's pregnant wife." "That's just it," Jed insisted, his weathered face creased with concern. "I've seen plenty of kidnapped folk in my time. They cry, they beg, they break down. She ain't done none of that. Just watches us like she's waiting." "You're getting jumpy in your old age," Silas laughed, clapping Jed hard on the shoulder. "Tucker, take the next watch. And keep your gun on her, pregnant or not. I don't want any surprises." As Tucker took his position, Mariah's eyes tracked his movement. She noted how he favored his right leg slightly, an old injury perhaps. Her gaze drifted to his gun belt, worn on the right hip but slightly loose. A man who wasn't used to quick draws then. One by one, she cataloged similar details about each gang member. Billy's nervous trigger finger, Clay's tendency to leave his rifle just out of reach, Wade's habit of dozing off during his watch. From his position by the horses, Billy watched their captive with growing unease. There was something familiar about her calm demeanor, something that tickled at his memory. He'd heard stories in saloons, whispered tales about a woman who... His eyes widened suddenly. Abandoning his task, he hurried over to where Jed was checking their ammunition supplies. "Jed," Billy whispered urgently, "I just remembered something. A story I heard in Silver Creek about a woman they called the Widowmaker." Jed's hands stilled on the ammunition box. "What about it?" "They said she was the deadliest shot in the territory. Took down the entire Carson Gang single-handed. But then she disappeared about 2 years ago, right around the time..." He glanced nervously at Mariah. "Keep your voice down," Jed hissed, pulling Billy further away from the others. "You sure about this?" "The descriptions match. They said she had this way about her, real calm-like, even in a firefight. And remember what that stranger called her yesterday? Miss Widow?" Jed felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Don't breathe a word of this to anyone, especially not Silas. Not until we're sure." But Mariah had already begun her subtle work. When Wade brought her water, she thanked him quietly and added, "It must be comforting, having a leader who values loyalty so highly." Wade frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Oh, nothing. Mariah smiled softly. I'm sure Silas would never abandon his men to save himself. Like he did in Tombstone. Wade's expression darkened. What do you know about Tombstone? Only what people whisper about. How he left 3 men behind to face the law while he rode away with all the gold. But I'm sure those are just rumors. The seed of doubt planted, Mariah watched as Wade returned to the campfire, noticing how he studied Silas with new eyes. Meanwhile, miles away, Caleb had managed to free himself from the fence post and rode hard to the nearest friendly ranch. By mid-morning, he'd gathered a small but capable group. Ezekiel Johnson, a grizzled Civil War veteran who'd seen his share of tracking parties, and Thomas Blackwood, a half-Cherokee tracker known for his uncanny ability to read the land. They're heading east, Thomas said, studying the ground where the gang's horses had passed. Keeping to the wooded areas, avoiding open ground. Smart, but not smart enough, Ezekiel added, pointing to subtle marks in the earth. They're weighed down, moving slower than they probably intended. We can catch them if we push hard. Caleb checked his rifle for the 10th time. Then let's ride. Every minute we waste. We'll find her, Ezekiel assured him, mounting his horse. But we do this smart, or we don't do it at all. Back at the outlaw camp, tension was building. During the evening meal, Mariah watched Silas swagger around the fire, boasting about past robberies. She waited until he paused for breath, then spoke in a clear, carrying voice. How many men have you lost over the years, Mr. Kane? The camp went silent. Silas turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. What did you say? I'm merely curious about your leadership style, Mariah continued calmly. Do you count the men who died following your orders? Or the ones you left behind to face the hangman's noose? Silas crossed the space between them in 3 angry strides, looming over her. You watch your mouth, woman. Or what? Mariah met his gaze steadily. You'll prove me right about how you handle challenges to your authority? For a moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Then Silas's hand shot out, grabbing Mariah's jaw roughly. One more word, and pregnant or not. Boss. Clay's voice cracked through the tension. Maybe we shouldn't. Maybe you should shut your mouth. Silas roared, releasing Mariah to round on Clay. Anyone else want to question how I handle things? The gang members looked away, but Mariah noticed how they exchanged glances when Silas turned his back. The cracks were beginning to show. Later that night, one of the younger outlaws, a hot-headed boy named Pete, decided to prove himself by confronting their unnervingly calm prisoner. Think you're clever, don't you? He sneered, standing over Mariah with his hand on his gun. Stirring up trouble. Maybe I should teach you some. Mariah's eyes met his, and Pete's words died in his throat. There was something in that gaze, something cold and deadly that sent chills down his spine. Without another word, he backed away, nearly tripping over his own feet. Everything all right, Pete? Billy called out, trying to hide a smile. Shut up, Pete mumbled, his face red as he hurried away from Mariah's watching eyes. When the gang moved camp the next morning, Mariah was ready. While they were distracted with breaking down the camp, she used a small rock to scratch marks into trees and boulders, symbols that looked like random vandalism to untrained eyes but carried clear messages for those who knew how to read them. 3 days east. 8 men, armed, watched the high ground. She worked carefully, never drawing attention to her actions. When they stopped to water the horses, she scratched another message. Second watch sleeps. Leader unstable. Move at midnight. Jed noticed her marking the stones but said nothing, his suspicions growing stronger with each passing hour. He'd heard enough stories about the Widowmaker to know that if their captive really was her, they were all in grave danger. As the day wore on, Silas grew increasingly agitated. Something about the way Mariah carried herself, the way his men seemed to look at her with a mixture of fear and uncertainty, set his teeth on edge. When they made camp that evening, he ordered double watches. And keep her away from the others, he snapped. I don't want her filling their heads with more nonsense, afraid of what else they might learn about you. Mariah's voice carried clearly in the evening air. Silas whirled on her. You think I don't see what you're trying to do? Turn my men against me. Your men seem quite capable of forming their own opinions, Mariah replied. Perhaps they're finally realizing what kind of man they're following. A muscle twitched in Silas's jaw. "Break camp," he ordered suddenly. "We're moving out? Now!" Tucker protested. "It's almost dark." Did I stutter? Silas's hand dropped to his gun. "Someone's tracking us. I can feel it. And I'm starting to think our guest here isn't as helpless as she appears." As the gang hurriedly packed up camp, Billy approached Jed one last time. "What if she really is the Widowmaker?" he whispered. "What do we do?" Jed watched as Mariah was helped onto a horse, noting how she seemed to move with a fighter's grace despite her condition. "We pray," he answered grimly, "that we're not about to find out." Miles behind them, Caleb, Ezekiel, and Thomas discovered one of Mariah's markers. Thomas ran his fingers over the scratches, his expression thoughtful. "Military code," Ezekiel said suddenly. "Modified, but I recognize the basic pattern." "Your wife served in the war, Caleb?" "No," Caleb replied slowly, remembering Mariah's strange reaction to Declan Graves. "At least, she never mentioned it." "Well, she's leaving us a clear trail," Thomas added. "And from what these marks say, she's doing a lot more than just waiting to be rescued." Ezekiel checked his guns with practiced hands. "Question is, what else don't we know about your wife?" Caleb stared at the marked stone, remembering all the little moments that had never quite made sense. Mariah's incredible aim when hunting, her instinctive awareness of her surroundings, the way she sometimes woke in the night reaching for something that wasn't there. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I aim to find out." The sun had set by the time Silas called another halt, his nerves clearly frayed. The gang set up a hasty camp, the men exchanging uncertain glances as their leader paced like a caged animal. Mariah sat quietly in their midst, her eyes reflecting the campfire's flames. She could feel the tension building, the way the gang was splintering under pressure. Soon, they would make a mistake. And when they did, she would be ready. She thought of Caleb, hoping he would understand why she had kept so many secrets. She thought of their unborn child, and the future she had dreamed of building. But most of all, she thought of the skills she had tried so hard to leave behind, skills that she might soon need to ensure that future existed at all. In the darkness beyond the firelight, a wolf howled. The sound carried across the prairie, wild and lonely, like a promise of things to come. Some of the gang members shifted uneasily, but Mariah smiled faintly. The night was just beginning, and with it, the real test of who would survive until dawn. The Widowmaker was stirring beneath her careful disguise, and soon, very soon, Silas Kane and his gang would understand just how badly they had miscalculated. They had thought they were hunting a farmer's wife. Instead, they had captured a legend, and legends, as they were about to learn, had teeth. Dawn broke over the outlaw camp with a blood-red sky. Mariah had spent the night observing the gang's routines, noting how their discipline had begun to fray under Silas's increasingly erratic leadership. Now, as the men stirred from their bedrolls, she knew it was time to make her first move. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when Mariah suddenly doubled over, clutching her stomach. Her gasp of pain cut through the quiet camp like a knife. "Something's wrong," she moaned, her voice trembling. "The baby." The gang members exchanged panicked looks. None of them had signed up to deal with a pregnancy crisis. "Do something," Billy urged, hovering nervously nearby. "I need water," Mariah gasped. "And something for the pain, please." Tucker hurried to fetch water, while Wade rummaged through their supplies for anything that might help. In the confusion, no one noticed how Mariah's eyes remained sharp and focused, tracking their movements. "Here," Tucker said, kneeling beside her with a canteen. As he leaned in, Mariah's hand shot out with snake-like speed, grabbing the knife from his belt. Before anyone could react, she was on her feet, the blade glinting in the morning light. "Nobody move," she commanded, her voice suddenly steady and cold. But Clay had been watching more carefully than the others. He tackled her from behind, sending the knife spinning away. Mariah fought with surprising skill, her elbow catching Clay's nose with a satisfying crunch, but there were too many hands grabbing her. "Tie her up," Silas barked, "and search her for any more weapons." As they secured her bonds, Billy stood frozen, his face pale. The way she had moved, precise, lethal, trained, He'd seen that kind of fighting before in stories about. It's her, he blurted out suddenly. Boss, I know who she is. She's the Widowmaker. A heavy silence fell over the camp. Silas turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. What did you say? The Widowmaker, Billy continued, his words tumbling out in a rush. The woman gunslinger from up north. They say she took down the entire Carson Gang single-handed. Disappeared about 2 years ago. The timing fits, and the way she moves. Silas threw back his head and laughed, but there was an edge to it. The Widowmaker? This pregnant farmer's wife. He strode over to Mariah, who met his gaze with unnerving calm. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. But Mariah's lips curved into a smile that made his laughter die in his throat. It wasn't the smile of a frightened captive. It was the cold, knowing expression of a predator. Silas's hand dropped to his gun. In one fluid motion, he drew it and pressed the barrel against Mariah's temple. Is it true? He demanded. Are you her? The Widowmaker. Mariah didn't flinch. Her eyes, hard as steel, bore into his. What do you think? Answer me. Silas's hand shook slightly. A man who needs to ask, Mariah replied softly, already knows the answer. Silas backhanded her across the face, but she barely swayed, that same unnerving smile never leaving her lips. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth, but her eyes held something that made him step back, not fear, but a calculating patience that chilled him to the bone. Over the next few days, Silas's paranoia grew like a cancer. He posted extra guards, changed their route repeatedly, and jumped at shadows. Every time he looked at Mariah, she seemed to be watching him, those knowing eyes following his every move. She's plotting something, he muttered to Jed one evening. I can feel it. Maybe we should just let her go, Jed suggested carefully. If she really is the Widowmaker. She's nothing. Silas exploded. Just a woman playing mind games. But his hand kept straying to his gun, and his eyes darted constantly to where Mariah sat. Meanwhile, miles behind them, Caleb's group had picked up their pace. They found more of Mariah's markings, not just directional signs now, but warnings and tactical information. Look at this, Ezekiel said, pointing to fresh scratches on a boulder. She's telling us about their guard rotations, weapons, everything. Your wife's not just leaving a trail, she's planning a battle. Thomas studied the marks with growing respect. These are military tactics. Professional ones. Who is she really? Caleb touched the marks his wife had left, remembering all the little mysteries about her that he'd never questioned. I'm starting to wonder if I ever really knew. Back at the gang's camp, Billy had begun spending more time near Mariah, drawn by a mixture of fear and fascination. One evening, while bringing her water, he finally worked up the courage to speak privately with her. I want out, he whispered, glancing nervously at the others. I never signed up for any of this. But Silas. He'd kill me if I tried to leave. Mariah studied him thoughtfully. You're right to be afraid of him, Billy. Men like Silas don't allow loose ends. She paused, letting that sink in. How many others has he killed to keep his secrets? Billy's face went pale. What do you mean? Think about it. The men who've disappeared over the years. The ones who talked about leaving. Where do you think they really went? She watched the fear grow in his eyes, knowing the seed she'd planted would take root. Jed observed these interactions from a distance, his weathered face creased with worry. He'd seen how Mariah was working on Billy, how she seemed to be orchestrating something larger than a simple escape. But every time he thought he'd figured out her game, she'd do something unexpected that made him question everything. One night, as the gang sat around the campfire, Mariah began speaking in a quiet voice that somehow carried to every ear. Have you ever seen a man die slowly? She asked, her eyes reflecting the flames. I have. The Carson Gang. They thought they were untouchable. 7 men, all killers, all proud. They never saw me coming. The gang members shifted uncomfortably, but none could look away as she continued. The first one died at sunset. He never even drew his gun. The second lasted until midnight, bleeding out in the dust. By dawn, there were 5 bodies cooling in the street. The last 2, she smiled that chilling smile. They try to run, but you can't outrun a shadow, can you? Her words hung in the air like smoke, and more than one man found himself checking the darkness beyond the firelight. Clay, who had been nursing a grudge since Mariah's escape attempt, decided to reassert his authority later that night. He approached her with a water canteen, intentionally spilling it. "Oops," he sneered. "Guess you'll go thirsty tonight. Unless—" His words cut off as Mariah moved. Just a slight shift, but something in it made him step back. His boot caught on a root, and he stumbled. The knife he'd been concealing flew from his hand. What happened next was too fast for anyone to follow clearly. There was a blur of movement, a choked cry, and then Clay lay still, the same knife buried in his chest at precisely the angle that suggested he'd fallen on it during his stumble. "Clay!" Tucker rushed forward, but it was too late. "Must have tripped in the dark," Mariah said quietly. Such a dangerous place to carry a knife. Silas stared at her bound hands, at the impossible angle of the knife, at the too perfect positioning of Clay's body. He opened his mouth to accuse her, but what could he say? That a pregnant, bound woman had somehow managed to kill one of his best men without leaving her spot by the tree? But her eyes met his across the firelight, and in them he saw the truth. Somehow, impossibly, she had done it, and she had done it in a way that left him powerless to prove it. The gang buried Clay at first light, their movements hurried and nervous. No one wanted to look too closely at the body, at the precise angle of the killing blow that spoke of expertise rather than accident. Mariah watched them work, her face a mask of appropriate concern. But inside, she felt a familiar coldness settling over her, the calculating focus she'd thought she'd left behind 2 years ago. The Widowmaker was truly awake now, and Clay's death was just the beginning. She thought of Caleb, following her trail, and prayed he would understand when he learned the full truth. She thought of their unborn child, and the future she was fighting to protect. But mostly, she thought about Silas Kane and his gang, who had made the mistake of thinking a pregnant woman would be easy prey. They would learn one by one just how wrong they had been. The Widowmaker hadn't gone soft during her years of peace. She'd simply been waiting, like a sword in its sheath, for the moment when she would be needed again. As the sun climbed higher, Mariah closed her eyes, appearing to doze. But beneath her calm exterior, she was planning her next move. Clay had been the most dangerous after Silas, the most likely to hurt her out of spite. With him gone, the gang's power structure would begin to crack. She could feel Silas watching her, his paranoia growing by the hour. Soon, very soon, that paranoia would drive him to make a mistake. And when he did, she would be ready. Billy approached with breakfast, his hand shaking slightly as he offered her a tin plate. "I'm sorry about Clay," he whispered. Mariah accepted the plate with a gentle smile. "Accidents happen in the dark, Billy. Best be careful they don't happen to you too." She saw the understanding dawn in his young face, the realization that he was watching a master at work. His fear of her was tempered now with something like hope. He was starting to see her as a possible salvation from Silas's tyranny. Jed watched this exchange from across the camp, his expression troubled. He could see the web Mariah was weaving, could appreciate the deadly skill with which she manipulated everyone around her. But he couldn't shake the feeling that they were all dancing to her tune, moving like puppets to a song only she could hear. The morning wore on, and the gang prepared to move camp again. Silas barked orders with increasing agitation, his eyes constantly darting to where Mariah sat. She met each of his glances with that same knowing smile, and each time, his hand would twitch closer to his gun. The Widowmaker was done hiding now. Like a wolf that had walked among sheep in borrowed clothing, she was slowly letting them see her true nature. One by one, they would understand exactly what kind of predator they had captured, and one by one, they would fall. The morning mist clung to the ground as Caleb, Ezekiel, and Thomas followed Mariah's trail through the rugged terrain. Ezekiel had been studying the marks she left behind with growing fascination, his weathered face creased in thought. Finally, he reined his horse to a stop beside a large boulder. Fresh scratches marked its surface, seemingly random to the untrained eye, but Ezekiel's expression changed as he studied them. "I've seen these before," he said quietly, running his fingers over the marks. "During the war, special forces used codes like this. Highly trained operatives working behind enemy lines." Caleb dismounted, approaching the boulder. "What are you saying?" These aren't just trail markers, Ezekiel explained, pointing to specific patterns. This is military intelligence. Guard rotations, weapons inventory, tactical weaknesses. Your wife, she's had training. Professional training. Thomas whistled low. That's some wife you got there, Matthews. Caleb stared at the markings, memories flooding back. Mariah's perfect aim when they went hunting. The way she always seemed to know when someone was approaching the ranch, long before they were visible. Her lightning-fast reflexes. 1,000 little moments that had seemed odd but harmless at the time now took on new meaning. Who is she? He whispered, more to himself than the others. Who did I really marry? Whoever she is, Ezekiel said carefully, she's a lot more than just a rancher's wife. These marks, they're the work of someone who's seen real combat. Someone who knows how to kill. Caleb sank onto a fallen log, his world spinning. The woman he loved, the mother of his unborn child. Had it all been a lie? He thought of her gentle smile, the way she sang while working in their garden, how she'd cry over injured animals. How could that be the same person who left these cold, precise military codes? Well, a familiar voice drawled from the trees. Looks like the husband's finally starting to figure it out. They spun around to find Declan Graves emerging from the morning mist, his black duster wet with dew. He rode a fresh horse and carried his rifle with casual confidence. You, Caleb growled, reaching for his gun. Easy now. Declan raised one hand in a peaceful gesture. I'm not here to cause trouble. Just thought you might want to know who you're really chasing. Talk fast, Ezekiel warned, his own weapon at the ready. Declan dismounted smoothly. Your wife isn't just any soldier or spy, Matthews. She's the Widowmaker. Most dangerous gunslinger north of the Mexican border. 23 confirmed kills, probably twice that many unconfirmed. The Carson Gang, the Thompson brothers, the Santa Fe massacre. All her work. You're lying, Caleb said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. Am I? Declan's smile was cold. Why don't you ask her about Silver Creek? About the boarding house fire that killed 3 men? About the bounty hunter she left paralyzed in Denver? If she's so dangerous, Thomas interjected. Why are you telling us this? Because I want to help you find her. Declan spread his hands. I know these hills better than anyone. I know how Kane's gang operates. Together, we could catch up to them in 2 days. And why would you help us? Ezekiel's eyes narrowed. Let's just say the Widowmaker and I have unfinished business. Declan's hand drifted to a long scar on his neck. She didn't just retire 2 years ago. She disappeared. Left a lot of loose ends. A lot of people wanting answers. Ezekiel moved closer to Caleb. We can't trust him. Man's got revenge in his eyes. But we might need him, Thomas pointed out quietly. If half of what he says is true. Before Caleb could respond, he spotted fresh markings on a nearby tree. Moving closer, he saw they were different from the others, not tactical information, but a message meant just for him. My love, trust your heart, not their words. Everything I've done was to protect our future. Stay strong. Caleb traced the marks with trembling fingers. Even in code, he could hear Mariah's voice, feel her presence. Whatever secret she'd kept, whatever life she'd led before, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Her love for him was real. I don't care who she was, he declared, straightening his shoulders. She's my wife now. She's carrying my child. That's all that matters. Noble sentiment, Declan sneered. But you might feel differently when you see her in action. The Widowmaker isn't known for her mercy. You said you want to help? Caleb faced him squarely. Fine. But understand this. We're doing this my way. She comes home safe, or not at all. Meanwhile, at the gang's camp, Silas Kane's grip on sanity was rapidly unraveling. Clay's death had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. He'd doubled the guards around Mariah, but that only seemed to amuse her. Afraid I might disappear in the night? She asked softly as he checked her bonds for the 3rd time that morning. Shut up, he snarled, but his hands shook slightly. Poor Silas. Mariah's voice was almost gentle. Seeing shadows everywhere. Wondering which of your men might turn on you next. It must be exhausting. I said shut up. He backhanded her across the face, but she barely flinched. Better watch that temper, she whispered. It might get you killed. Silas stormed away, barking orders at his increasingly nervous men. Tucker, Wade, check the perimeter again. Billy, stop staring into space and clean those guns. Jed, keep your eyes on her. Boss, Jed ventured carefully. Maybe we should just cut our losses. The ransom ain't worth. We're seeing this through. Silas's voice cracked like a whip. Nobody questions my decisions. Nobody. Back on the trail, Caleb's group had picked up speed, with Declan proving his worth as a guide despite Ezekiel's continued suspicion. They found more of Mariah's markers, each one leading them closer to their quarry. She's leading us to their hideout, Declan explained, studying a fresh set of scratches. Old mining camp in the high country. Defensible position, but only one escape route. You seem to know an awful lot about it, Ezekiel observed darkly. Declan's smile didn't reach his eyes. Let's just say the Widowmaker and I have history there. 2 years ago, she took something from me. Something I mean to get back. What exactly did she take? Caleb demanded. My reputation. My career. Declan's hand drifted to his scarred neck again. I was the best bounty hunter in 4 territories. Then she came along. Left me for dead in that same mining camp we're headed to. By the time I recovered, she'd vanished. And with her, everything I'd built. So this is about revenge, Thomas said flatly. This is about justice, Declan corrected. Your wife's got blood on her hands, Matthews. Sooner or later, she has to answer for it. Caleb's fist connected with Declan's jaw before anyone could react. The bounty hunter staggered but didn't fall. She's answered enough, Caleb growled. You help us find her, fine. But if you try anything at all, I'll kill you myself. Declan wiped blood from his lip, that cold smile returning. We'll see. Their chance came sooner than expected. As they crested a ridge, they spotted 2 riders in the distance, scouts from Kane's gang, checking their back trail. Perfect, Declan whispered, already raising his rifle. No. Caleb grabbed his arm. We take them alive. We need information. The ambush was quick and clean. Ezekiel and Thomas circled wide, while Caleb and Declan provided a distraction. Within minutes, they had one scout unconscious and the other disarmed and terrified. The camp, Caleb pressed his gun to the scout's head. Where is it? 3 miles north, the man babbled. Old mining camp. But you don't want to go there. That woman, she ain't natural. Killed Clay like it was nothing, made it look like an accident. She's got the boss spooked, got everyone jumping at shadows. Is she hurt? The baby? She's fine. Calm as you please, even with all that's happened. But mister, the scout's eyes were wide with fear. If she really is who they say she is, the Widowmaker, you might be better off letting her handle things herself. Caleb knocked the man unconscious with his pistol, but then turned to his companions. We move now. Tonight. But as they prepared to ride, they found one last message from Mariah, freshly carved into a fallen log. My love, I'm ready. Come at midnight. Watch for my signal. And remember, whatever you see, whatever you learn about me, know that everything I am, everything I've done, has led me to you. To us. To our child. Trust me one last time. Caleb traced the words, feeling their weight, their truth. Whatever secrets Mariah had kept, whatever darkness lay in her past, he knew her heart. And he would trust her, one last time. As they mounted up, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Somewhere ahead, in an old mining camp, the woman known as the Widowmaker was preparing to reveal herself fully at last. And God help anyone who stood in her way. The wind carried the howl of a lone wolf across the darkening land, a sound that seemed to speak of coming violence, of secrets revealed, of justice long delayed. Caleb checked his guns, straightened his hat, and pointed his horse north. It was time to meet his wife. All of her. Dawn crept over the abandoned mining town like a fever, painting the weathered buildings in sickly shades of yellow and red. In the heart of the camp, Mariah sat beneath a tattered awning, watching the gang members move about their morning routines. After Clay's death, the atmosphere had grown thick with tension and fear, perfect conditions for what she had planned. She caught Billy's eye as he passed, noting how the young outlaw quickly looked away. The seeds of doubt she'd planted were growing well. Now it was time to water them. Billy, she called softly, her voice carrying just far enough. Could I trouble you for some water? He hesitated, glancing toward where Silas was cleaning his guns with obsessive intensity. Then, making his decision, he approached with a canteen. Thank you, Mariah said, her voice gentle, the voice of a woman who understood his fears, who might protect him. You remind me of someone I knew once. A young man caught up with the wrong crowd, thinking he had no choice. What happened to him? Billy asked, unable to help himself. He died. Mariah's eyes held his, following orders from a man who saw him as expendable. Just like Silas sees you. Billy's hand trembled slightly on the canteen. You don't know that, don't I? She smiled sadly. I've known men like Silas all my life, Billy. The kind who lead through fear, who sacrifice loyal followers to save themselves. The kind who've already decided which of their men will die first when trouble comes. She let that sink in, watching the fear grow in his young face. From across the camp, Jed observed their interaction with shrewd eyes. The old outlaw had survived this long by knowing which way the wind was blowing, and right now it was blowing toward change. Later that morning, Jed approached Mariah under the pretense of checking her bonds. You're playing a dangerous game, he murmured. Aren't we all? She replied quietly. The question is, Jed, which player will still be standing when the game ends? Jed's weathered face showed nothing, but his eyes held understanding. Silas is losing his grip. Yes, Mariah agreed. And when he falls, those closest to him will fall too. Unless. She let the word hang in the air between them. Jed straightened up, decision made. I'll keep watch tonight. Western side of camp. That night, Billy crept to Mariah's side while the others slept. His hands shook as he pressed something cold and heavy in her palm, a small revolver he'd taken from their weapons cache. If Silas finds out, he whispered. He won't, Mariah assured him, quickly concealing the weapon. You've chosen wisely, Billy. When the time comes, stay close to me. The next morning, Silas's paranoia reached new heights. He stormed through the camp, eyes wild, accusing anyone who met his gaze of conspiring against him. You, he rounded on Jed, been mighty friendly with our guests lately. And you, he turned to Billy, who flinched, always whispering, always watching. Think I don't see it? Boss, Jed started, his voice calm. You're not thinking straight. Not thinking straight? Silas's hand dropped to his gun. I'm thinking clearer than ever. You're plotting with her. All of you. Nobody's plotting anything. Tucker tried to intervene, but Silas shoved him aside. Meanwhile, on a ridge overlooking the mining town, Caleb's group had taken up position. Through his spyglass, Declan studied the layout of the camp. 2 guards on the north entrance, he reported. Another watching the old mine shaft. Rest of the gang spread out through the buildings. How many total? Ezekiel asked. 7, counting Silas. Plus your wife. Declan's mouth twisted in a cold smile. Though from what we've heard, she might not need much rescuing. We move at nightfall, Caleb declared, but even as he spoke, movement in the camp caught his attention. Mariah had managed to start a small cooking fire, and the smoke rising from it formed distinct patterns that matched the military codes they'd been following. She's signing to us, Ezekiel translated quickly. 3 men loyal to Silas, 4 wavering. Weapons cached in the assay office. As they watched, Tucker, Silas's right-hand man and leader in training, approached Mariah's fire. He reached down to stop her from adding more wood, putting himself perfectly in line with her concealed hands. The shot was muffled by the crackling fire, but Tucker's cry of pain echoed through the camp as he stumbled back, clutching his shoulder. The bullet had struck precisely where it would disable but not kill, a shot that couldn't possibly have been an accident, though it would appear that way. My gun, Tucker gasped. Must have. Caught on something. Mariah's face showed only concern, but her eyes gleamed with satisfaction. One more piece removed from the board. As Tucker was helped away, she turned to the remaining gang members. How many more accidents before you see the truth? She asked softly. How many more men have to fall for Silas's madness? Her words struck home. The outlaws exchanged uneasy glances, seeing their own fears reflected in each other's eyes. First Clay, Wade muttered. Now Tucker. Shut up, Silas roared, but there was a tremor in his voice now. She's trying to turn you against me. Can't you see it? We see plenty, Jed replied quietly, taking a step toward Mariah. We see a leader who's lost his way, who's more likely to get us killed than lead us to profit. Traitors. Silas drew his gun, swinging it wildly between Jed and Billy. You're all traitors. No, Silas. Mariah's voice cut through his rage like a knife. They're survivors. Something you used to be, before fear ate away your judgment. For a moment, something like clarity flickered in Silas's eyes. Then it vanished, replaced by pure, murderous rage. I'll kill you, he snarled. I'll kill all of you. He fired wildly, the bullet splintering would near Billy's head. The young outlaw dove for cover as the camp erupted into chaos. On the ridge, Caleb started forward, but Declan grabbed his arm. Wait, the bounty hunter urged. Look at what she's doing. She's breaking them apart from the inside. If we move now, we'll only unite them against us. That's my wife down there. Caleb struggled against his grip. That's the Widowmaker down there, Declan corrected. And she's doing what she does best. Trust me, I've seen her work before. She's not just fighting them. She's dismantling them, piece by piece. Indeed, as they watched, the gang continued to fragment. Wade and another outlaw had taken cover behind barrels, unwilling to side with either Silas or the others. Billy had scrambled to Mariah's side, while Jed stood his ground between them and Silas, his hand hovering near his gun. You're done, Silas, Jed declared. Put down the gun before you get us all killed. You're choosing her? Silas's laugh held an edge of madness. A woman? Our prisoner. We're choosing to live, Wade called from his position. Something you don't seem interested in anymore. Mariah watched the scene unfold with the patience of a spider in its web. Everything was falling into place. Silas's paranoia, the gang's fear, the shifting loyalties. Soon, very soon, it would all come to a head. She thought of Caleb watching from the ridge, probably struggling to reconcile this calculated manipulation with the loving wife he knew. She hoped he would understand that both sides of her were real, the gentle rancher's wife and the deadly strategist. She had buried the Widowmaker deep, but never truly killed her, because she knew that someday her skills might be needed to protect those she loved. That day had come. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the abandoned mining town, Mariah felt the weight of the revolver Billy had given her. Soon, she would use it. Soon, all pretense would fall away, and the Widowmaker would emerge fully from behind her careful disguise. She almost pitied them. They had thought they were capturing a helpless woman, never realizing they were bringing a wolf into their fold. Now that wolf was about to bare its teeth, and there would be no place left to hide. The tension in the camp had reached a breaking point. Silas stood alone, his gun hand shaking as he faced the remnants of his once loyal gang. In his eyes, Mariah could see the last threads of sanity beginning to snap. On the ridge, Caleb watched with a mixture of awe and fear as his wife orchestrated the gang's destruction. He had thought he was coming to rescue her, but now he wondered if he was really coming to witness her victory. When the shooting starts, Declan said quietly, and it will start soon, we need to be ready to move fast. His hand strayed to the scar on his neck. The Widowmaker never leaves witnesses. Caleb turned to him sharply, understanding dawning in his eyes. You're not here to help us, are you? You're here to kill her. Declan's cold smile was all the answer he needed. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. In the mining camp below, the Widowmaker prepared to show her true nature at last. And on the ridge above, her husband faced a choice between trust and doubt, between the woman he loved and the legend he was only beginning to understand. The abandoned mining town lay quiet in the gathering dusk, save for Silas Kane's increasingly unhinged rants. He paced the dusty street between the weathered buildings, his gun wavering between his men, who watched him with growing unease. You're all blind, he shouted, spittle flying from his lips. Can't see how she's playing you. Well, I won't stand for it. He fired a wild shot into the air, making several gang members flinch. But Mariah didn't move, didn't even blink. She simply watched, knowing the moment she'd been orchestrating had finally arrived. Look at him, she said softly, her voice carrying to every ear. Is this the man you want to trust with your lives? A man who shoots at shadows? Wade, who had been loyal to Silas for years, shook his head slowly. "Boss, you need to calm down. Calm down." Silas swung the gun toward him. "You're with her too, aren't you? All of you. Conspiring behind my back." "Nobody's conspiring, Silas." Jed stepped forward, hands raised. "Put down the gun before someone gets hurt." "Someone's already hurt." Silas gestured wildly toward the assay office where Tucker lay recovering from his accidental shooting. "Clay's dead. Tucker's down. And you all just stand there, letting her poison your minds." "The only poison here," Mariah's voice cut through his ranting like a steel blade, "is your paranoia. These men trusted you, followed you. And how do you repay that trust? By threatening to kill them." Her words struck home. The remaining gang members exchanged glances, a silent agreement passing between them. "Take him," Jed ordered quietly. What followed was over in seconds. Wade and two others rushed Silas while Billy covered them with his rifle. Silas managed one wild shot that splintered Wood harmlessly before he was disarmed and forced to his knees. "You can't do this," he screamed. "I'm your leader." "Not anymore," Wade said grimly, securing Silas's hands behind his back. "Put him in the old jail," Mariah suggested calmly. "It's secure, and you can watch him easily from the street." The men looked to Jed, who nodded. As they dragged Silas away, his curses echoing off the buildings, Billy moved to stand beside Mariah. "You were right," he said, loud enough for the others to hear. "About everything. He would have got us all killed." Mariah touched his arm gently. "You showed real courage, Billy." Standing up to him wasn't easy. One by one, the remaining gang members gathered around her, looking to her for direction, without even realizing they were doing it. She had become their de facto leader without ever raising her voice or firing a shot. Jed watched this transition with shrewd eyes, calculating his odds. He'd survived this long by backing the right horse, and right now, Mariah looked like his best bet for making it through whatever was coming. "What now?" he asked, making his allegiance clear with that simple question. "Now," Mariah smiled, "we prepare for what's coming." Meanwhile, on the ridge overlooking the town, Caleb watched the scene unfold through his spyglass. "We have to move," he insisted. "Now, while they're distracted." "Wait," Declan urged. "Let them finish tearing themselves apart. Why risk?" "I'm done waiting," Caleb cut him off. "That's my wife down there. My child. We move now." Ezekiel and Thomas checked their weapons, ready to follow Caleb's lead. But Declan held back, his face unreadable in the gathering darkness. Back in the town, Mariah made her way to the jail, her steps deliberate and unhurried. The single lamp inside cast strange shadows through the barred window as she approached Silas's cell. "Come to gloat," he spat. "No," she replied quietly. "I came to introduce myself properly." She stepped into the lamplight, and something in her bearing changed, a subtle shift that made Silas press back against the far wall of his cell. "You see, Silas," she continued, her voice taking on a colder edge, "you made a serious mistake when you chose my ranch to raid. You thought you were kidnapping a helpless farmer's wife. Instead," she smiled, and it was the smile that had haunted bounty hunters' nightmares. "You captured the Widowmaker." The color drained from Silas's face. "No," he whispered. "You're lying." "Am I?" She moved closer to the bars. "Ask yourself, how did Clay really die? That knife wound, so precise, so accidental. And Tucker's gun? Such an unfortunate misfire, hitting exactly where it would disable, but not kill." Silas's eyes widened with growing horror as the truth sank in. "All this time, you were playing you like a fiddle," Mariah finished. "Breaking your gang apart piece by piece?" "Yes. You never stood a chance, Silas. The moment you threatened my family, you were already dead. You just didn't know it yet. Listen," he licked his lips nervously. "We can make a deal. I've got money hidden." "I'm not interested in deals," she cut him off. "But I will give you a warning, since you gave me one of my most entertaining performances in years. Declan Graves is out there, watching this camp, and he's not here to help your prisoner. He's here to collect the bounty on my head." Silas's eyes narrowed. "The stranger who visited your ranch?" "He's been hunting me for 2 years," Mariah confirmed. "Ever since I left him with that lovely scar on his neck. And now he's manipulating my husband, using him to get to me? If you know all this, why tell me? Mariah's smile widened slightly. Because, Silas, you're about to become a very useful distraction. She turned to leave, but Silas called after her. Your husband, does he know what you really are? He's about to find out, she replied without turning back. Outside, the gang's remaining members were growing restless. Wade and another outlaw, Martinez, had begun arguing over who would take charge of their weapons cache. I've been here longer, Wade insisted. You were also Silas's right hand, Martinez shot back. Why should we trust you? Mariah let the argument build, watching as old grievances and fresh fears bubbled to the surface. The more they fought amongst themselves, the easier they would be to control. On the ridge, Declan had drawn Ezekiel aside while Caleb and Thomas planned their approach. Listen, Declan said quietly, there's something you need to know. The bounty on the Widowmaker's head is $50,000. Dead or alive? Ezekiel's eyes narrowed. So that's what this is really about. Think about it, Declan pressed. That kind of money could set a man up for life. And she's not some innocent victim. She's a killer. Always has been. She's also carrying Caleb's child, Ezekiel reminded him. Sacrifices have to be made in the name of justice. Declan's hand strayed to his scar. You've seen what she can do. How she manipulates people. She needs to be stopped. But Ezekiel had already drawn his gun. Caleb, he called out. We got a problem. Before he could say more, Declan struck like a snake, knocking the weapon aside. The two men grappled in the darkness as Caleb and Thomas rushed to help. In the town below, the sound of fighting from the ridge caught Mariah's attention. She smiled slightly, knowing her warning to Silas would soon serve its purpose. Did you hear that? She asked innocently. Sounds like trouble in the hills. Maybe someone should check it out. Wade and Martinez, eager to prove themselves, quickly volunteered. As they headed toward the ridge, Mariah caught Billy's eye and gave a slight nod. The young outlaw understood. Things were about to get interesting. The night air crackled with tension as all the pieces Mariah had so carefully arranged began to move. Above, Caleb and his group struggled with the revealed traitor in their midst. Below, the fractured gang waited unknowingly for the chaos about to descend. And in the middle of it all stood the Widowmaker, finally free to be herself again. She felt the familiar cold focus settling over her, the strategic clarity that had made her legend. Everything was proceeding exactly as she had planned. The only variable was Caleb, her husband, the man she loved, who was about to see her true nature unleashed. She touched her swollen belly gently, thinking of the future they had planned together. Your father's a good man, she whispered to her unborn child. Let's hope he can understand why your mother sometimes has to be something else. The sound of approaching footsteps told her Wade and Martinez were returning from their scouting mission. Soon, they would report the fighting they'd heard. Soon, the camp would erupt into chaos as Caleb's group engaged. And in that chaos, the Widowmaker would make her final move. She could already hear Silas shouting from his cell, trying to warn his former men about her true identity. But it was too late, far too late. She had spent days weaving her web, positioning every piece exactly where she needed it. Now it was time to spring the trap. The first gunshot split the night like thunder, and the final act began. The moon cast long shadows through the abandoned mining town as Caleb and Ezekiel crept between the weathered buildings. Thomas had stayed behind to secure their horses and watch for reinforcements, while Declan had disappeared into the darkness, a fact that worried Ezekiel more than the armed outlaws ahead. 2 guards by the assay office, Caleb whispered, checking his rifle. Another near the old saloon. Ezekiel nodded, his war experience showing in his silent movement. They split up, each taking a different approach. Caleb moved like a shadow toward the nearest guard, who was half asleep at his post. One quick strike with his rifle butt, and the man crumpled without a sound. Across the street, Ezekiel dispatched the second guard with similar efficiency. But the third man, near the saloon, caught a glimpse of movement. He opened his mouth to shout a warning, but Caleb's thrown knife found his throat first. The outlaw went down with barely a gurgle. 3 down, Ezekiel murmured as they regrouped. But they'll be missed soon enough. Inside the main building, Mariah heard the subtle sounds of the guards being eliminated. A slight smile played at her lips as she turned to Billy and Jed. It's starting, she said quietly. Are you ready? Billy gripped his stolen revolver nervously, while Jed simply nodded, his weathered face showing grim determination. They had chosen their side, for better or worse. The first real gunshot shattered the night silence as one of Wade's men spotted Caleb's approach. Instantly, the camp erupted into chaos. Mariah seized the moment, her pregnant form doing nothing to slow her decisive movements. Billy, watch the back door, she commanded. Jed, with me. Anyone still loyal to Silas is a threat. As if summoned by his name, a crash and curse from the direction of the jail signaled that Silas had managed to break free. In the confusion of the initial assault, one of the guards had dropped his keys within the prisoner's reach. Find her. Silas's voice carried over the gunfire. Find that witch and bring me her head. Caleb and Ezekiel had taken cover behind an overturned wagon as return fires splintered the wood around them. They had accounted for 4 more gang members when movement caught Caleb's eye, a familiar figure darting between buildings. Mariah, he called out, breaking cover to run toward her. She spun at his voice, the revolver Billy had given her raised and ready. For a moment, they froze, staring at each other across the chaotic battlefield. Then her face softened with emotion. Caleb, she breathed, lowering her weapon. They came together in a fierce embrace, heedless of the bullets flying around them. Caleb's hand found her swollen belly, reassuring himself that she and their child were safe. I'm so sorry, Mariah started to say, but Caleb cut her off with a quick kiss. Later, he said, right now we need to end this. A bullet struck the wall inches from their heads, forcing them apart. They moved in perfect synchronization, taking cover on opposite sides of the street. Mariah's shot dropped an outlaw who had been aiming at Caleb, while his rifle took out another trying to flank their position. Just like hunting deer, Caleb called to her with a grim smile. Except the deer shoot back, she returned, her own smile showing the Widowmaker's deadly focus. The crack of another rifle split the air, but this shot came from an unexpected direction. Declan had appeared on a second-story balcony, and his aim was deadly. Before anyone could react, he had Caleb in his sights. Drop the gun, Widowmaker, he shouted. Or your husband dies here, and now. Mariah's face showed no emotion, but her mind raced through possibilities. She knew Declan's patterns, his weaknesses. He always took the high ground, always went for the perfect shot. Last chance. Declan's finger tightened on the trigger. Wait. Mariah stepped into the open, hands raised. You want me? Come and get me. She turned and ran toward the mine entrance. Declan, unable to resist the chance to end his hunt, took the bait. He leaped from the balcony to follow her. No. Caleb tried to follow, but more gunfire from Wade's remaining men forced him back to cover. Mariah led Declan deeper into the mine shaft, the darkness swallowing them both. She knew he would follow. His pride would allow nothing else. And she knew something he didn't. She had spent the last few days memorizing every tunnel, every crossbeam, every shadow. Stop running, Widowmaker. Declan's voice echoed off the rock walls. Face me. Like you faced me in Denver, she called back, her voice bouncing confusingly off the walls. Hiding behind hostages? Or in Tombstone, shooting from ambush? She heard his frustrated growl, heard him moving exactly where she wanted him. 3 more steps. The trap was simple but effective. A support beam, already weakened, needed just one shot at the right angle. Mariah provided it. The tunnel collapsed between them, not enough to cause a cave-in, but enough to trap Declan in a dead end. You'll suffocate in there, he shouted through the rubble. No, she replied calmly. But you might if you don't start digging soon. Back outside, the battle had turned decisively. Billy, proving his newfound courage, spotted Wade trying to circle behind Caleb and Ezekiel. Look out, he shouted, jumping from his position to tackle the older outlaw. Wade's gun went off, the bullet striking Billy in the chest. But his sacrifice had given Caleb the moment he needed to eliminate Wade with a well-placed shot. Billy. Mariah reached the young outlaw's side, cradling his head. Did I do good? He gasped, blood staining his shirt. You did wonderful, she assured him, her voice gentle. Rest now. You're free of them. His last breath carried a smile of peace. Jed, watching from behind a water trough, made his decision. He He stood slowly, hands raised. "I surrender," he called out. "And I know where Silas kept his money, his contacts, everything. It's yours if you let me live." Ezekiel covered him, while Caleb checked for weapons. But Mariah's attention had shifted. She felt Silas's presence before she saw him. He emerged from behind the jail, looking half mad but dangerous. His gun was aimed straight at her heart. "You ruined everything," he snarled. "My gang, my reputation, everything." "You did that yourself," Mariah replied calmly, turning to face him. "The moment you decided to attack a pregnant woman." "The Widowmaker," he spat. "Should have killed you the moment I knew. But you didn't," she said simply. "And now you never will." They moved at the same instant. Silas was fast, faster than a man his size should be. But Mariah was faster. Her bullet caught him in the chest, even as his shot went wide. Silas stumbled, disbelief crossing his face. "How?" "I told you," Mariah said softly. "The moment you threatened my family, you were already dead." He fell face first into the dust, and silence finally descended over the mining town. Dawn was breaking as they took stock of the aftermath. 6 gang members dead, including Silas and Wade. 2 more wounded and captured, including Tucker. Jed had surrendered, and Declan was trapped in the mine until help could dig him out. Billy's body lay peaceful, covered with a blanket, his final act of courage to be remembered. Caleb found Mariah standing in the middle of the street, watching the sunrise. She looked exhausted but undefeated, one hand resting protectively on her belly. "Are you hurt?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "The baby's fine. Moving a lot. I think all the excitement stirred them up." "I meant you." She turned to face him fully. "Caleb, I should have told you. About who I was. What I've done." "I know who you are," he said firmly. "You're my wife. The mother of my child. Everything else, we'll figure it out." Tears filled her eyes, the first real emotion she'd shown since the battle began. "I never wanted this life to touch us. I thought I'd left it behind. Sometimes the past finds us." He drew her close. "But we face it together." Ezekiel approached, respectfully clearing his throat. "Thomas is gone for the sheriff and his posse. They'll be here by nightfall to collect the prisoners and the dead." Mariah nodded. "We should be gone by then. The Widowmaker needs to disappear again." "She already has," Caleb said quietly. "All I see is my wife, who did what she had to do to protect our family." The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows behind them as they prepared to leave the battlefield behind. The legend of the Widowmaker would grow with this tale, but for Mariah, it would be the last chapter. She had a new life waiting, a future built on love rather than violence. As they mounted their horses, Mariah took one last look at the mining town. The Widowmaker had emerged one final time to protect what she loved, and now that part of her could truly rest. The woman who rode away was simply Mariah Matthews, wife, mother-to-be, and survivor. The story would be told differently in every saloon from Texas to Montana, but only a handful of people would know the truth. The Widowmaker hadn't gone soft. She had found something worth more than her legend. She had found a love worth laying down her guns for, and a future worth fighting to protect. Behind them, the sun painted the sky in shades of promise, and ahead lay home. The morning sun climbed higher over the abandoned mining town as Caleb and Ezekiel gathered the surviving outlaws. Jed stood quietly with his hands bound, while Tucker and Martinez nursed their wounds under Thomas's watchful eye. "The sheriff's office is 2 days' ride," Ezekiel said, checking the prisoners' bonds one last time. "We'll need to take shifts watching them." "I know a shorter route," Jed offered. When the others looked at him suspiciously, he shrugged. "I meant what I said about wanting to make things right." Meanwhile, Mariah searched the mine entrance where they had trapped Declan. The rubble had been cleared enough to show he had somehow escaped, likely through another shaft they hadn't known about. "He'll be back," she said quietly when Caleb approached. "Declan's not the type to let go." "Then we'll be ready," Caleb replied, touching her shoulder gently. "But first I think we need to talk." They found a quiet spot away from the others, sitting on the steps of the old assay office. For a long moment, Mariah stared at her hands, gathering her thoughts. "I was 19 when I killed my first man," she began softly. "He murdered my sister in cold blood, and the law wouldn't touch him because of his family's connections. I learned to shoot, to fight, to survive. And I learned I was good at it. Caleb listened silently as she continued. The Widowmaker wasn't born from desire for violence. She was born from necessity. There were too many men like him, men who thought they could hurt people without consequences. I became the consequence they never saw coming. The Carson Gang? Caleb prompted gently. They were burning out homesteaders, killing entire families. Her voice hardened at the memory. Someone had to stop them. After that, well, word spread. People started coming to me for help, and I gave it, because someone had to. What changed? A soft smile touched her lips. I met you. Saw a different kind of strength in the way you built things instead of destroying them. I realized I was tired of being death's messenger. I wanted to create life instead. She placed his hand on her swollen belly, where their child moved beneath. This is what I want now. What I've wanted since the day I fell in love with you. I never thought my past would find us like this. Caleb drew her close. Listen to me. Whatever you did, whoever you were, you did it for justice. To protect people who couldn't protect themselves. That's nothing to be ashamed of. But I've brought danger to our door, she whispered. Declan won't stop. A gunshot cut through their conversation, the bullet splintering wood inches from their heads. They dove for cover as more shots rang out. Riders coming in, Thomas shouted from his position. At least 8 of them. Mariah's eyes scanned the terrain, taking in positions and angles with practiced ease. Declan's hired guns, she concluded. He's using them to flush us out. Indeed, Declan's voice carried across the morning air. Bring me the Widowmaker, and the rest of you can ride away. Otherwise, nobody leaves this town alive. Like hell, Caleb growled, checking his rifle. To everyone's surprise, Jed spoke up. Untie me. I can help. Why should we trust you? Ezekiel demanded. Because I've seen enough killing, Jed replied simply. And because he nodded to Mariah, showed me there's still a chance to choose different. Mariah studied him for a moment, then nodded to Caleb. Once freed, Jed immediately moved to a defensive position, his experience showing in his choice of cover. They'll try to split us up, Mariah said, taking charge naturally. Force us to divide our attention. Caleb, you and Thomas take the north side. Ezekiel, watch our backs. Jed, with me, will give them something to think about. Her tactical assessment proved accurate. The hired guns attempted to flank their position, but Mariah had already anticipated their moves. She and Jed provided covering fire while Caleb and Thomas picked off anyone who tried to rush their position. Just like the old days, Jed commented as they reloaded. Let's hope not, Mariah replied. I'd like everyone I care about to survive this time. A movement caught her eye, Declan, trying to work his way behind their lines. But before she could warn the others, Ezekiel spotted him too. The old veteran's shot went wide, and Declan's return fire caught him in the shoulder. Ezekiel went down hard. Cover me, Mariah shouted, already moving. She reached Ezekiel's position as Caleb and the others intensified their fire, keeping the attackers at bay. Got careless, Ezekiel grunted as she examined his wound. Got brave, she corrected. Now stay still. But the battle's momentum had shifted. With Ezekiel down, they were more vulnerable. Mariah knew she had to end this now. Declan, she called out, her voice carrying clear and cold. You want me? Let's finish this. Just you and me. Like real hunters. So you can trap me again. His voice mocked from somewhere in the rocks. No tricks this time. You've waited 2 years for this chance. Don't tell me you're afraid to take it. There was a pause then. The others stand down. No interference. Agreed? Mariah, no. Caleb started to protest, but she silenced him with a look. Trust me, she whispered. One last time. She stepped into the open street, her pregnancy making her movements slightly slower, but no less graceful. Declan emerged from behind a boulder, his rifle held ready. You've lost your edge, he taunted, circling her. Gone soft playing house with your rancher. Have I? She smiled that cold Widowmaker smile. Or have I just learned there are things worth fighting for besides revenge? He fired first, fast and accurate. But Mariah was already moving, her return shot catching his rifle and spinning it from his hands. He drew his revolver, but she had anticipated that too. Her second bullet took him in the gun arm. You could have killed me in Denver, he gasped, clutching his wound. Why didn't you? Because I was already changing, she replied. Already looking for a way out. But you couldn't let it go, could you? The Widowmaker doesn't get to just walk away. He lunged for his fallen rifle. Her final shot caught him in the chest. He looked almost surprised as he fell. She does now, Mariah said quietly. The hired guns, seeing their employer fall, quickly lost their appetite for battle. They rode away, leaving their dead behind. But victory had come at a cost. Ezekiel's wound was serious, requiring immediate attention. There's a town about 3 hours' ride from here, Jed offered. Doctor there's discreet, doesn't ask questions. They fashioned a travois to transport Ezekiel, who drifted in and out of consciousness. The small group set out, their prisoners in tow, into the late morning sun. Think he'll make it? Thomas asked quietly as they rode. He's tough, Caleb replied. Too stubborn to die from something as simple as a bullet. The town Jed had mentioned turned out to be little more than a handful of buildings clustered around a dusty main street. But true to his word, the doctor asked no questions when they brought Ezekiel in. While the physician worked, Caleb found Mariah sitting on the doctor's porch, watching the sunset. What are you thinking? He asked, sitting beside her. About choices, she replied. About how sometimes the past never really lets go. We just learn to carry it differently. He took her hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of both her old life and her new one. Whatever comes next, we face it together. She leaned against him, letting out a long breath. I never thought I'd have this, she admitted. A home. A husband who knows all of me and loves me anyway. A child on the way. I thought the Widowmaker had closed those doors forever. Maybe she opened them instead, Caleb suggested. Everything you were, everything you did, it led you to our ranch that day. To us. Inside, they heard Ezekiel groan as the doctor worked, but his voice was strong when he cursed, making them both smile. We should reach home in 2 days, Caleb said, assuming our friend Jed's directions hold true. They will, Mariah assured him. He's chosen his path now, same as I did when I found you. The next morning, with Ezekiel stabilized and the prisoners secured, they began the final leg of their journey. The terrain was easier here, the trail winding through gentle hills rather than harsh mountains. Mariah rode beside Caleb, one hand occasionally touching her belly where their child moved. The Widowmaker's guns were packed away, not discarded, but no longer needed. She had found a different kind of strength, a different way to protect what she loved. The sun painted the sky in shades of promise as they rode toward home, toward their future. Behind them lay the legend of the Widowmaker, and ahead lay the life they would build together. The wind carried the sound of their horses' hooves like a drumbeat, marking the rhythm of their journey home. Home to their ranch, to their quiet life, to the peace they had fought so hard to protect. And if sometimes, in the dark of night, Mariah still woke reaching for weapons that weren't there, well, Caleb would simply hold her closer, reminding her with his presence that she had found a better way to be strong. The Widowmaker's last ride had ended not in death, but in life, in love, in hope, and that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the familiar rolling hills as Caleb and Mariah's ranch came into view. Smoke rose from several chimneys in the distance. Their neighbors had kept the home fires burning during their absence. As they approached, figures emerged from the nearby homesteads, gathering to welcome them home. Sarah Montgomery, their closest neighbor, was the first to reach them, her weather-worn face creased with concern and relief. Thank the Lord you're both safe. We've been sick with worry since we found the signs of struggle. Behind her, other familiar faces appeared, the Hendersons, the Wilsons, old Jim Parker with his 3 sons. They had all come, drawn by the bonds of community and the stories that had already begun spreading across the territory. Is it true? Young Tommy Henderson asked eagerly. About the Outlaws and the shooting and... Tommy, his mother scolded, but Mariah smiled gently. It's true that good people stood together against those who would do harm, she said carefully. That's the only part of the story worth telling. The community helped them settle back in, taking care of their horses and bringing food they had prepared. Sarah had kept the house clean and aired out, while Jim Parker and his boys had maintained the basic ranch operations in Caleb's absence. Couldn't let your stock suffer, Jim said gruffly when Caleb tried to thank him. That's not what neighbors do. The next few days were filled with the sounds of hammering and sawing as repairs began on the damage the gang had caused. Caleb worked from sunrise to sunset, but he wasn't alone. Neighbors came daily to help, bringing tools, supplies, and willing hands. Mariah, now in her 8th month of pregnancy, supervised the work from the porch, her quiet authority drawing respect from even the most skeptical of their neighbors. They had all heard whispers about her past by now, but seeing her guide the repairs with the same careful attention she gave to preparing meals or tending the garden helped bridge the gap between legend and reality. Jed, who had been released into Caleb's custody after testifying against his former gang members, proved himself invaluable during the rebuilding. His knowledge of construction, gained from years of casing buildings for robberies, was now turned to honest work. "Never thought I'd enjoy building something more than planning to rob it," he commented one evening as they finished raising a new barn wall. "Feels good, creating instead of destroying." Caleb studied the older man thoughtfully. "Could be steady work if you're interested in staying on." Jed's weathered face showed surprise, then gratitude. "You trust me?" "After everything." "Mariah trusts you," Caleb replied simply. "That's good enough for me." In the guest room, Ezekiel continued his recovery under Sarah Montgomery's capable nursing. His wound had been severe, but his spirit remained unbroken. He spent long hours talking with Mariah, sharing stories of his own battles, both in war and in finding peace afterward. "The hardest fight," he told her one afternoon, "isn't surviving the violence. It's learning to live with the quiet afterward." Mariah nodded, understanding deeply. "How did you manage it?" "Found something worth building," he said, nodding toward the window where Caleb could be seen working. "Same as you did. The past doesn't go away, but it gets easier to carry when you're carrying it toward something good." As the weeks passed, Mariah found herself drawn into the community in unexpected ways. Women who had once been wary now sought her advice on protecting their homes and families. She taught them simple defensive techniques, ways to be strong without sacrificing their gentler natures. "It's not about becoming hard," she explained to a group of homesteaders' wives. "It's about being prepared, about knowing you can protect what matters most." The legend of the Widowmaker continued to grow in distant saloons and around far-off campfires, but in their community, it began to fade. People saw instead a woman building a life with her husband, preparing for their child, helping her neighbors. The gunslinger became a memory, replaced by something more powerful, a leader who used her strength to unite rather than divide. News arrived via the station master that Declan had survived his wounds, though he would never fully recover. He had been found half dead by a traveling priest, who took him to a monastery in New Mexico. Reports suggested he spent his days in quiet contemplation, his desire for vengeance burned away by pain and failure. "Good," was all Mariah said when she heard. "Some ghosts need to rest." One evening, as they sat on their newly repaired porch watching the sunset, Caleb took Mariah's hand. "I've been thinking about everything that happened," he said quietly. "About who you were, who you are now, about how much stronger we are together." Mariah squeezed his hand. "Having regrets?" "Only that I didn't know sooner. Could have saved us both some worry." He smiled. "You didn't have to carry that burden alone for so long." "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid you'd see me differently. Afraid the past would destroy what we were building. Instead, it made it stronger." He touched her swollen belly gently. "Everything you are, the fighter, the protector, the survivor, it's all part of what makes you an amazing wife. And what will make you an incredible mother." The community's support continued to strengthen. When word spread that Mariah was nearing her time, women appeared daily with meals, baby clothes, and generations of wisdom. Men stopped by with offers of help with the ranch work, ensuring Caleb could be there for his wife. Sarah Montgomery organized a quilting circle, but the conversations over needle and thread went far beyond typical gossip. These women, who had once viewed Mariah with suspicion, now sought her strength and guidance while offering their own kind of wisdom in return. "A woman's got to be strong out here," old Mrs. Wilson declared, her needle flashing in the lamplight. "Ain't nothing wrong with being able to protect your own. Why, my grandmother fought off raiders with nothing but a rolling pin and a bad temper." The night Mariah went into labor, the entire community held its breath. Sarah and the other women took charge of the birthing room, while Caleb paced outside with Jed, Ezekiel, and half the men in the county. The sun was just rising when a baby's first cry split the morning air. Sarah emerged, beaming, to announce the birth of a healthy baby girl. Caleb found Mariah propped up in their bed, tired but radiant, holding their daughter. The baby had her mother's dark hair and her father's steady gaze. "She's perfect," he whispered, gathering them both in his arms. "What shall we name her?" Mariah asked softly. Caleb thought for a moment. "Hope," he suggested, "because that's what she represents. Hope for the future, for new beginnings." Hope Matthews. Mariah tested the name. A good name for a strong girl. Outside, the community celebrated. Jed and Ezekiel shared a bottle of whiskey on the porch, while Sarah organized the women bringing food and gifts. The sound of laughter and joy filled the air that had once echoed with gunshots. Later that evening, as the celebrations quieted and the family had a moment alone, Mariah nursed her daughter while watching the sunset through their bedroom window. "The Widowmaker seems like a dream now," she mused. "Like someone I used to know, but can barely remember." "She'll always be part of you," Caleb said, sitting beside them. "But now she's just one chapter in a much larger story." Mariah smiled down at their daughter, who had fallen asleep at her breast. "A story about finding home," she added. "About learning that true strength isn't in how many enemies you defeat, but in how many lives you touch. How many people you protect and support." The night settled softly around their ranch, peaceful and secure. In nearby houses, lights glowed warm and welcoming. The sound of evening chores and quiet conversations drifted on the gentle breeze. This was what they had fought for, not just survival but community, not just peace but belonging. Hope slept on, unaware that she represented something profound, the moment when a legend laid down her guns and chose love instead. When the Widowmaker became simply Mariah Matthews, wife, mother, and protector of a different kind of peace. Outside, a lone wolf howled in the distance, not a threat now, but a reminder of the wild spirit that still lived in all of them. Mariah smiled, remembering how she had once been like that wolf, solitary, dangerous, free. But she had found something better, a pack, a home, a future. The legend of the Widowmaker would fade into frontier history, but Mariah's legacy would live on in the strength she gave her community, the love she shared with her family, and the daughter who would grow up knowing that true power comes not from the ability to take life, but from the courage to nurture and protect it. The stars emerged one by one, watching over the peaceful ranch where a legend had finally found her rest, and a new story was just beginning. Dawn broke over the Matthews Ranch with gentle grace, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. The morning dew sparkled on the spring grass as Mariah sat on the porch, cradling 6-month-old Hope while Caleb worked in the nearby corral. The peaceful scene was a far cry from the violence that had marked their lives just a year before. Hope gurgled happily, reaching for a strand of her mother's dark hair. Mariah smiled, breathing in the sweet morning air and her daughter's innocent scent. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention, but there was no tension in her posture now, just the natural awareness that had become as much a part of her as breathing. A stranger rode up to the front gate, dust coating his travel-worn clothes. "Pardon, ma'am," he called out, tipping his hat. "I'm looking for information about someone who might have passed through these parts a while back. They call her the Widowmaker." Before Mariah could respond, Sarah Montgomery appeared from around the barn, where she'd been collecting eggs. "Widowmaker," she repeated, exchanging a knowing look with several other neighbors who had gathered to hear the stranger's query. "Can't say that name means anything around here. But I heard tell," the stranger began. "Lots of tales in these parts," Jim Parker interrupted, having wandered over from mending a nearby fence. "Most of them just wind and wishful thinking. Now, if you're looking for a place to water your horse..." The stranger, sensing he would get no more information, accepted the offered hospitality with grace. As he followed Jim toward the water trough, the neighbors shared secret smiles. They had become protective of their own, and the woman who had once been the Widowmaker was now simply their Mariah, friend, neighbor, mother. Near the corral, Jed was helping Caleb break in a new stallion. The former outlaw had become an invaluable part of the ranch, his rough past transformed into wisdom and steady capability. The local children, who once would have feared such a man, now begged him for stories and riding lessons. "Never thought I'd find peace doing honest work," Jed commented, watching the stallion prance around the corral. "Guess sometimes the longest road leads you exactly where you need to be." Caleb clapped him on the shoulder. "You've more than earned your place here, old friend. This ranch is as much your home now as ours." Inside the house, on the mantel, sat a letter from Ezekiel. The old veteran had recovered fully from his wounds and set out on a new adventure, but his words remained as a testament to the bonds forged in their shared trials. My dear friends, the open road calls again, as it always has. But know that in you, I found something rare, a reminder that second chances and new beginnings are possible at any age. Mariah, you showed me that our past actions don't define us. It's what we choose to do with our present that matters. Caleb, your unwavering faith in love's power to redeem and transform is a lesson I'll carry with me. Take care of little Hope. She represents everything we fought for, a future where strength and gentleness can coexist, where old wounds can heal, and where love conquers fear. Until our trails cross again, Ezekiel *. Mariah read the letter often, finding comfort in its wisdom. Now, watching Hope play with a wooden horse Jed had carved for her, she made a silent vow. "You'll never know the life I led," she whispered to her daughter. "But you'll know strength. You'll know love. You'll know the difference between surviving and living." Caleb found them there, his face soft with pride as he watched his wife and daughter. The years had only deepened his love for Mariah, his appreciation for the complexity of her spirit. He saw in her not just the deadly accuracy of the Widowmaker or the gentle touch of a mother, but the perfect balance of both, protection and nurture, strength and tenderness. "What are you thinking?" Mariah asked, noticing his gaze. "About how lucky I am," he replied, sitting beside them, "to have a wife who can mend fences and mend hearts, who can fight like an army, but loves like an angel." The ranch had flourished under their care, becoming more than just a homestead. It was a symbol of hope for the community, a place where second chances were given and redemption was possible. The barn that had been rebuilt after the gang's attack now housed twice as many horses. The fields yielded rich harvests, and the herds grew strong and healthy. That evening, as the sun began to set, Mariah retrieved a small wooden box from beneath their bed. Inside lay the last physical reminder of her past, a silver pendant she had worn during her days as the Widowmaker, engraved with the image of a wolf. She walked to the fire pit outside, where Caleb and Hope waited. Without ceremony, she dropped the pendant into the flames, watching as the silver began to melt. "Are you sure?" Caleb asked softly. "The Widowmaker protected those who couldn't protect themselves," Mariah replied, holding Hope close. "Now it's time to protect our daughter by letting that part of me rest. She needs a mother more than she needs a legend." Later, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, they talked about their plans for the future. The ranch would grow, they decided. They would build a bigger house, plant an orchard, maybe start a horse breeding program. "Hope will learn to ride as soon as she can walk," Caleb said, watching their daughter sleep in Mariah's arms. "And she'll learn to be strong in her own way," Mariah added. "Not with guns or violence, but with conviction and compassion." Like her mother, Caleb smiled. The night air was filled with the gentle sounds of their world. Crickets chirping, horses nickering softly in the barn, the distant howl of a wolf that no longer seemed threatening. Peace had settled over the ranch like a warm blanket, wrapping them in its secure embrace. From the highest hill, one could see the entire Matthews ranch spread out below, the sturdy house with its welcoming porch light, the newly painted barn, the fertile fields stretching toward the horizon. The setting sun painted everything in shades of gold and purple, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward tomorrow. Jed's voice carried from the barn where he was finishing the evening chores, singing an old trail song that spoke of home and belonging. In the kitchen, Sarah Montgomery and other neighbors were preparing to leave after sharing the evening meal, their laughter mixing with the peaceful sounds of the night. Hope's soft coo drew her parents' attention back to the miracle in their arms. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's gentle eyes, but her spirit was uniquely her own, untouched by violence, full of promise and possibility. Sometimes, Mariah said softly, I wonder what I did to deserve this much happiness. You chose it, Caleb replied, drawing her close. Every day, you choose love over violence, creation over destruction. That's worth more than any legend. The stars emerged one by one, witnesses to the peace that had been so dearly won. The ranch stood as a testament to the power of redemption, of love's ability to transform even the deadliest gunslinger into a nurturing mother, the most hardened outlaw into a trusted friend. As darkness settled fully over the land, the porch light cast a warm glow over the family. Caleb, Mariah, and little Hope, together in the home they had fought so hard to protect. Their laughter carried softly on the evening breeze, a melody of joy and contentment. The camera pulls back, rising above the peaceful scene. We see the ranch growing smaller, a beacon of light in the gathering darkness. The mountains stand guard in the distance, their ancient peaks touched by the last rays of sunset. The land stretches out, wild and beautiful, but no longer threatening. From this height, we can see the entire story written on the landscape. The trails that led them here, the battles fought and won, the peace that finally bloomed in this quiet corner of the frontier. The Widowmaker's legend may live on in whispered tales and fireside stories, but here, in this moment, there is only Mariah Matthews, holding her daughter close as the day gentles into night. The screen fades to black, but the echoes remain. A baby's laugh, a mother's lullaby, a father's proud voice. The sound of horses in the barn, of wind in the grass, of life continuing in all its simple, precious beauty. And somewhere in the distance, a wolf's howl, not a threat now, but a reminder of the wild spirit that lives in all of us, tamed but never quite forgotten. The legend of the Widowmaker ends not with a gunshot, but with a lullaby. Not with violence, but with peace. Not with death, but with new life. And in that ending lies the most powerful story of all. The story of love's ability to transform, heal, and create something beautiful from even the darkest past. Hope Matthews sleeps peacefully in her mother's arms, unaware that she represents the final victory of the Widowmaker. Not a victory won with bullets and blood, but with courage and love. The future stretches out before them, bright with promise, rich with possibility. And so our story ends where all the best stories do, with hope, with love, with family, with home. The legend fades into history, but the truth remains, carried forward in the strong, gentle heart of a woman who chose love over legend, and found her greatest strength in the simple joy of a peaceful morning on her ranch, holding her child, loved by her husband, surrounded by community, finally, completely, at peace. They say every myth has its roots in truth. So ask yourself, what would make a woman become death itself? And more importantly, what would make death choose to become human again? If this tale of redemption, justice, and the power of love moved you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping frontier stories where legends come alive and justice wears many faces. Share this video to spread the legend of the Widowmaker, and leave a comment telling us, what would you give up everything to protect? Until our next tale, remember, sometimes the deadliest force isn't the gun in your hand, but the love in your heart.